In our history, the French Revolution radically changed the world. Formerly unquestioned absolutist power was cast away as Europe would face decades of war. In this alternate timeline, this is still the case. However, the world is radically different. Our point of divergence in this timeline falls back all the way to the War of Spanish Succession. The Battle of Blenheim quickly ended the war, paving the way for the Bourbon dynasty in Spain to eventually become the kings of France as well, due to some suspicious deaths. Bavaria also became extremely powerful, eventually annexing what remained of the Habsburgs following Hungary's independence in the War of Spanish Succession. With the collapse of the Habsburgs, the Prussians were able to seize Silesia and participate in an alternate partition of Poland, giving them more land in the south as compared to our history. The undisputed hegemon of Europe, the Bourbon dynasty, controls the most land in the world. With territories in America, the Philippines, the Bourbon Empire is one which the sun never sets. However, this increased success of the Bourbon dynasty would not save them from the French Revolution. With no precedent against the nobility and their absolutist reign, their decadence would remain unchallenged, giving the people of France the opportunity to proclaim a republic through violent revolution. As we all know, the French Republic, and soon the French Empire under Napoleon, would be so close to uniting the entirety of Europe. However, the coalition of nations would eventually defeat Napoleon. With this incredibly distant point of divergence, the balance of power in Europe had already been skewed to such an extent that it left a huge power vacuum, big enough for Napoleon to dominate Europe. But would he succeed? Would this alternate geopolitical scenario give Napoleon enough of an advantage to be victorious where he historically failed? Will the Bourbons manage to stay relevant after an empire-collapsing catastrophe of revolutions in Europe? Would Britain resist the urge to cannibalize their greatest rival in the face of the Napoleonic conquest of Europe? While our point of divergence may have been in 1704, 1789 is where this story truly begins. Welcome to Project Bourbon. I'm really excited to share this project with you all. It was really fun to make. The Napoleonic era is so interesting, and with these new dynamics in Europe, it really turned into something spectacular. Please remember to give the video a like if you like it, and consider subscribing if you want to see more. With that, let's get into some alternate history. In our history, France faced the First Coalition, which encompassed nearly every one of their neighbors. While they would initially fumble, the revolutionary zeal of their soldiers would prove to give them an incredible advantage against their foes. However, there was one general who was undefeated as of yet, whose maneuver warfare defined war in this period: Napoleon. Born to a Corsican noble family, he became a French citizen after Genoa could no longer hold on to the island anymore. Initially very loathsome of French culture, he would adapt to the times as he rose in the ranks of the French army. Now, after the French Revolution had begun, he and his other generals were tasked with defeating their enemies. The French Republic had tasked several generals, including Napoleon, to manage a front line each. Jourdan would hold the Rhine, Moreau would advance in the Pyrenees, and Napoleon would invade Italy. In our history, Napoleon would manage to scourge through Italy, focusing specifically on reaching the bottom side of their enemy of Austria. In this timeline, Bavaria owns all of Austria, so the natural assumption would be that the French Republic's goals would be the same. However, Napoleon would instead be tasked with marching south and prioritizing the capitulation of the Bourbonic Two Sicilies. While the French mainland may have fallen to revolution, the Bourbons did not need to attempt another escape to their allies' lands, as they had the capability of continuing the resistance in their other crown lands of Spain and the Two Sicilies. The royal family would vacate to Madrid, which essentially was their summertime capital, in order to reorganize the French and Spanish troops in order to destroy the revolutionary forces. However, the hardships that the royal family had put onto their peasantry was also emulated in Spain. Thus, the people of Spain would execute their own revolution. The Bourbon monarchy would have to, once again, quickly vacate to another region to continue the resistance. However, Napoleon had made quick work of Naples and was beginning to organize attempts to invade Sicily. As Sicily was deemed unsuitable for the counter-revolutionary effort, the Bourbons instead had to make the long trek to their colonial empire, scrounging up all the resources that they could muster. The Spanish armada that had remained loyal to the Bourbons had organized a mass exodus of all those loyal to the king. Britain had joined the First Coalition in order to prevent the status quo from being questioned in their homeland. However, by doing so, they are technically attempting to restore their greatest rival. Due to the Spanish Succession War succeeding, and the Austrian Succession War causing the Bourbons and British to clash, Britain had all of its American possessions taken away from them, as they were incorporated into the Bourbon Empire. In order to get British aid in this counter-revolution, the Bourbons had promised the British that they would transfer their land back once the revolutionary threat had been dealt with. The British would accept this offer, and would support counter-revolutionary insurrections in the mainland. This had also meant that the Spanish would be besieging Gibraltar in attempts to bring it back into their state. While the North American territories had fallen to local French colonial troops, Gibraltar had been managed to be claimed by the British and kept through the Spanish and Austrian succession wars. This is because of Gibraltar's amazing defensive terrain and British naval dominance preventing any sort of siege that couldn't be mitigated by the Royal Navy resupplying the garrison. The introduction of Britain into the counter-revolutionary forces had meant that Sicily would remain unconquered. The Bourbon exiled government would still technically be in control, but it would be heavily garrisoned by the British. With Napoleon unable to organize a naval invasion, he would turn his eyes north in order to defeat the Bavarians. Venice had remained neutral during the War of the First Coalition. They were hoping that through neutrality, they would manage to prevent their destruction. However, both the Austrians and French needed Venice in order to facilitate the victory in their war. Therefore, when Napoleon would approach Venice, he threatened to destroy it. This led to the government of Venice admitting defeat, allowing itself to be partitioned between Austria and France in order to preserve the city. In this timeline, the French military position would mean that they would be a lot more amicable to the Venetians. The Spanish Revolution had required French aid in suppressing the counter-revolutions, leading to the Bavarians resisting the advance of the French army. In this timeline, Napoleon would negotiate with the Venetians. If they were to reform and become more liberal, they would become a French ally and be given Bavarian land. Seeing the destruction that Napoleon had unleashed on the Bourbons, the Venetians agreed. Napoleon and his troops would march through Venetian land and open a second front with the Bavarians. With the sudden flip of Venice, the Bavarians had attempted to move their forces to the Italian front to defend themselves. However, it was too late, and the Bavarian position was compromised. Bavaria would sue for peace, conceding territory to the Venetian Republic. With the British lacking any means of resistance after their mainland European territory of Hanover was captured, they too would sign a peace with the revolutionaries. Thus, the War of the First Coalition was over. In just 5 years, nearly the entirety of the Latin world had fallen to revolution. And with it, the idea of a Roman Republic being revived was beginning to be popularized in these nations. While there would be some attempts to cooperate, these were put very much on the sidelines, as the revolutionaries were busy consolidating their grasp on their countries. However, they would have much more success getting control over their territory as compared to the Bourbons in exile. With the end of the First Coalition, the exiled Bourbons had to face the reality that they may never come back home. While many would be eagerly attempting to consolidate their power in the colonies, this ambition of reconquest would not be shared by the locals. With the British occupying their old territories, the viceroyalties that had incorporated the conquests were now forced to give them up. The Bourbon dynasty looked weak and willing to sell out their own subjects for the comfort of their palaces. All across the Bourbon colonial empire, secessionist movements began to grow. In an attempt to mitigate the unrest, the Bourbon monarch, Charles IV, would issue reforms, allowing for these viceroyalties to manage their own armies. While initially, this reform seems to both reassure the local governments and allow for the Bourbon monarchy to not be overextended in their future reconquest wars. In reality, this reform would quickly work against the monarchy, as now these colonies had the military strength to be able to defy their monarch if they ever wished to secede. And this would soon become a reality as they would face an insurgency in Quebec. The viceroyalty most impacted by the territorial transfers was the viceroyalty of New France. The British would claim the Hudson's Bay, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland, all controlled by New France previously, and the Bourbon monarchy would claim the Louisiana territory as crown land in order to consolidate their grasp on their new Mare Nostrum, the Caribbean, leaving the viceroyalty of New France to become the viceroyalty of Canada. The Canadians would be incredibly frustrated, so much so that they would use their new military to defy the Bourbons. What does a betrayal of this magnitude mean for the world? Will the Bourbons manage to restore order in Canada while maintaining control over their other viceroyalties? How will America, France, and Britain react to the Canadian secession? Will Napoleon's Egyptian campaign end differently than our history? All of these questions and more will be answered in episode 2 of Project Bourbon, as the War of the Second Coalition begins. And that's the first episode of Project Bourbon. Thank you so much for watching. I'm really excited to do this new era of history. Shout out to Ballin Aura University and Enzo Rafael Souza Silva for being channel members. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to have your name shouted out at the end of my video, please consider supporting the channel by getting a membership. Thank you all so much for watching. Please leave a like if you like it. I hope to see you in the next episode and that you have a good day. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Please subscribe. Have a good day. Bye bye.
Bye.